Hello, guys, and tonight we're going to start looking at Chapter 25, Section 1, which is the end of prosperity. All right, first semester you guys learned about some of the new products that were becoming available in the 1920s. We call the 1920s the Roaring Twenties. People were buying everything from automobiles to washing machines to radios. More expensive products became more affordable to buyers for a number of reasons. The assembly line, which was obviously made famous by Henry Ford. You had installment credit, where people who could not afford high price items could now buy them in low monthly payments. You had what we consider to be laissez faire economics. Laissez faire is a French word which means hands off. The government had their hands off the economy. They were allowing businesses to make decisions without government control, which led to a lot of consumer products and few regulations on businesses and rising stock prices, which we'll talk about in a little bit. In the 1920s, stock prices go up, and up. And eventually, we lead into the Great Depression with the stock market crash in 1929. Unemployment is a huge problem in the Great Depression, which we'll be talking about here in the next week or so. These are some pictures that show members of the U.S. Citizens that are waiting in soup kitchen lines who are unemployed and literally lost everything. And a lot of what they call Hoovervilles popped up, where people were literally living in makeshift shanty towns located all over the United States. All right, the start of the decline. Herbert Hoover was elected president in 1928, and he promised to continue prosperity of the 1920s. And during his presidency, the stock market experienced unbelievably rapid growth with rising stock values. We'll talk more tomorrow in class about how stock prices work. There are some underlying economic conditions that caused the Great Depression to happen. First, it was an uneven distribution of income. At the time, the 20% of the richest Americans controlled 80% of the money in the country. What that means is you have a very few rich people that controlled the majority of the money that was being used in the American economy. You also had many farmers who were in poverty and could not sell many of their products, and this was due to overproduction. And we'll talk a little bit more about that tomorrow in class as well. Improved efficiency by businesses caused products to pile up in warehouses. And as products piled up in warehouses, prices dropped. Kind of like if you go to a Walmart the day after Christmas or day after Halloween or Valentine's Day. If you have a surplus of products, the price falls because nobody wants to buy them. And that's kind of what was happening. So the assembly line that Henry Ford had created, the new machines that were being used in factories all over the United States, actually was causing the economy to fail. And also, like we talked earlier, consumers bought many items on credit. They didn't have the money to pay for the items, so they took out loans, promising to make small monthly payments to pay off the cost of the product. Problem is, people began to lose their jobs, wages got cut, and people were unable to make their payments. We also had an issue that stuff that was happening around the world also played into our economy struggling in the United States. Europe was already suffering through a depression, and a lot of that was caused by the effects of World War I. We will talk a lot of tomorrow in class about speculation and buying on margin. Today in the PowerPoint here tonight, I'm just going to give you kind of a quick overview of what buying on margin and speculation is. All right, like I talked about earlier, in the 1920 stock market prices kept going up in value. And investors decided that they wanted to buy and get in on the action. Problem is, it's kind of like if you are sitting at home, you only have $50 in your wallet, and you really want to buy some stuff because prices are really, really, really low. So you decide to go to your older brother and say, hey, I got a deal for you, buddy. Why don't you give me $50? I want to buy some more stuff. And if I buy that stuff, all right, I'm hoping that later on I'll be able to turn around and sell it at a profit. Okay? But the deal is, I'm going to have to pay my brother some interest. Okay? And that's what we call kind of this idea of buying on margin. You pay for a small part of the stock's price as a down payment, you borrow the rest. Just like when you borrow money from your brother or the bank or anybody else. If you borrow money, you have to pay interest. And the deal is, if stock prices continue to go up, this buying on margin will pay off. The problem is, if stock prices drop, you're not going to be able to afford to pay back the loan. And like I said, we will go over the buying on margin scenario tomorrow in class to make sure you guys totally understand that. All right, the crash of the market. Okay, you guys will learn in a later class in econ as seniors that the stock market is a roller coaster. The idea behind the stock market in a nutshell is buy low and sell high. So all during the 1920 stock prices were going up. Investors were getting in on the market and the prices were going higher and higher and higher and higher. Well, all of a sudden, what happens is they hit a peak in the summer of 1929. Prices were as high as they were going to get. And just like if you're at Great America and you're on the top of the roller coaster, you hit that peak of that roller coaster, now you're going to go down the hill. So as we start going down the hill, investors start to decide that they need to sell and sell their stocks quickly. Well, the problem is, if we have too much of something, having too many sellers, prices will plummet. And on October 29, 1929, a day we call Black Tuesday, investors sold 16.4 million individual shares of stock in the U.S. stock market, and prices plummeted. Banks wanted money back and ran short of money, and we'll talk a little bit more about that tomorrow in class. After the crash, the chain reaction that happens. Banks were failing, going out of business, so not a lot of money was being lent out in loans. People became scared about their money, fearing the safety of putting it in the banks, and they didn't purchase anything because they were worried about money. Businesses sold less and less. Profitability went down, and businesses, some were forced into bankruptcy. Businesses that were struggling laid off workers. As a result, Americans got paid less, and Americans had trouble paying everything from their home mortgages to their heating bills to those installment loan program plans. They had to buy things like radios and things like that. All right. On the business cycle. The business cycle is the up and down roller coaster of the U.S. economy. We are either in an up cycle, a down cycle, or we're at what we call the peak, or what we call the trough. Okay? So what we have here is the business cycle. And business cycle, there's two main things we'll need to understand about the business cycle. We are in what we call a recession. A recession is where the economy is slowing down. Businesses are producing less. They're laying off workers. And if a recession becomes really long, it becomes what we call a depression. Okay? And when we're in a depression, we have high unemployment. A lot of people are struggling to pay their bills. And we have very, very, very bad economic situation. Now, this here shows the business cycle. Okay? Here's the roller coaster. The roller coaster goes down, hits the bottom, expands, goes back up to the peak, goes down, hits the bottom, and then goes back up to a peak. A recession is, like I said, is when the economy is struggling. If we have a really long recession, we call that a depression. And we're going to learn that in the 1930s, we go through one of the worst economic depressions in American history. All right, causes of the Great Depression. We'll go more in depth on these tomorrow in class. But the causes of the Great Depression were overproduction of goods by both farmers and businesses, and we'll give you examples of those tomorrow in class. Another cause of the Great Depression was uneven distribution of wealth. We already talked about that, where 20% of the population held 80% of the wealth. We also had what we call an overvalued stock market, where the stock market was going up so fast and so quickly that at some point it had to go down. And we'll go in more depth on these tomorrow in class. Another cause was, like we talked about earlier, individual consumer debt. Too many Americans buying on what we call installment credit. Hoover's response to the crash. President Hoover believed in not giving aid directly to the poor. And as a result, many people blamed Hoover for the problems that existed. And one of the things we get is what we call Hoover flags and Hoovervilles. And Hoover believed that the government should not give money directly, but to facilitate cooperation, not control of the economy. And he believed that Americans would pull themselves out of this depression on their own efforts and not on the government bailing them out. And here are some pictures of some of the Hoovervilles and the Hoover flags. What were Hoover's solutions? Hoover's solutions to these problems were huge public works projects. One of the biggest is Hoover Dam, which was built on the Colorado River on the border of Nevada and Arizona. The last thing that we'll talk about is what we call the bonus army. We had a large number of World War I soldiers that were due payment in 1940. If you're in a bad situation, you want to get paid early. They asked for payment early. The government said no. And as a result, 15,000 soldiers marched to Washington to basically demand their pay. All right. Eventually, the U.S. Senate said, no, we're not going to give you your pay. A lot of the veterans left, but 2,000 did stay. And in a very poor decision, in my opinion, General MacArthur decided to use the army and use gas and bayonets to drive out the protesters. When all was said and done, one was killed, many were injured, and the public was very angry over how Hoover handled the situation. And he was entering the 1932 election, which he would face future President Franklin Delano Roosevelt. And here's a picture of one of the bonus armies. And in 1932, we elect President Franklin Delano Roosevelt. And we'll talk a little bit about that tomorrow, with the election of Franklin Delano Roosevelt and why that happened. All right. We'll see you tomorrow in class, and I hope you enjoyed this video.